America has a remarkable number of places that officially do not exist, officially do nothing interesting, or officially encourage you to mind your own business, sometimes at gunpoint. Some of these places have leaked into public knowledge anyway. Others remain almost entirely in the dark. These are 6 places in America that are forbidden to be spoken of. Number 6. Harvey Point Defense Testing Activity, Hartford, North Carolina. Harvey Point sits on a peninsula jutting into Albemarle Sound in northeastern North Carolina, about 15 miles from the town of Hartford. It is officially administered by the U.S. Navy. What it actually is, and what it has been since it was established in 1961, is the CIA's primary demolitions and weapons training facility, the place where operatives learn to blow things up before going somewhere to blow things up. The government has never officially acknowledged what goes on at Harvey Point beyond the bare minimum required to explain why a heavily fenced, heavily guarded installation exists in rural North Carolina. What has come out through decades of investigative journalism, declassified reports, and the occasional congressional disclosure that was almost certainly more than the CIA intended. The 1974 book, The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, written by former CIA officer Victor Marchetti and former State Department officer John Marks, noted that demolitions and heavy weapons training took place at a secret CIA base in North Carolina. That was as specific as it got publicly for years. In 1975, the President's Commission on CIA Activities disclosed that the facility was used to train domestic and foreign operatives in bomb detection and disposal, which is a description so narrow relative to the full scope of what happened there that it functioned more as a cover statement than a disclosure. By the late 1990s, more had accumulated. A 1985 Washington Post report revealed the CIA had trained a group of Lebanese operatives at Harvey Point for what was described as a hostage rescue mission. That group later killed 80 civilians in a failed assassination attempt. In 1998, the New York Times reported the CIA had used Harvey Point to train security forces from the Palestinian Authority. A 1999 report from Jane's Intelligence Review, the respected London-based military journal, provided additional details about CIA commando training at the facility. Each of these disclosures was a piece of the picture. The full picture remains classified. The facility today covers approximately 2,800 acres of land and water. It is surrounded by fencing and signs that give the standard federal restricted area warnings. Local residents in Hartford County know it exists, know better than to approach it, and have coexisted with it for over 60 years without receiving any official explanation of what their neighbor does. Harvey Point does not have a public affairs office. It does not respond to media inquiries. It is the kind of place that trains people to operate in environments where those skills are necessary, and whose operational history only becomes known when those operations go wrong in ways large enough to surface in congressional investigations or major newspapers. The physical setup of Harvey Point is itself informative about its purpose. The facility includes mock villages for urban warfare training, ranges for various weapons systems, and waterfront access on Albemarle Sound that supports maritime operations training. It was reportedly used to train the teams that conducted operations in Iraq and Afghanistan following September 11, 2001, and has been linked in published reporting to the preparation of operations that the CIA has never officially acknowledged. The facility has also reportedly trained operatives from Allied intelligence services. The breadth of those relationships is another element of Harvey Point's history that the government maintains strictly off the record. What is notable about Harvey Point in the broader context of classified American infrastructure is that its existence is not particularly disputed. It is on maps. Local residents know it is there. Its history has been pieced together through 60 years of journalism. What remains disputed, or more precisely, what remains officially unaddressed, is the specific nature of what it does and has done. The gap between what is known about Harvey Point and what the government is willing to confirm is unusually wide, even by the standards of classified military installations, which is itself a signal about the sensitivity of its operational history. Number 5. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center, Bluemont, Virginia. Mount Weather sits in the Blue Ridge Mountains near the town of Bluemont in Clark County, Virginia, about 65 miles from Washington, D.C. It is operated by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and its official designation is the Mount Weather High Point Special Facility. What it is, in plain terms, is the backup government of the United States, designed to operate in the event that the actual government is destroyed. The facility was constructed beginning in the late 1950s, during the height of Cold War nuclear anxiety, as a hardened underground complex capable of housing the essential functions of the executive branch in the aftermath of a nuclear attack. It contains dormitories, a hospital, a power plant, a water treatment system, a communications center, and the infrastructure necessary for a functioning government to operate indefinitely without surface contact. The above-ground portion of the facility is substantial, a cluster of federal buildings on a guarded mountaintop. The underground portion is considerably larger and considerably more secretive. Mount Weather became briefly and uncomfortably public in December 1974 when a TWA Boeing 727 crashed into the mountain during approach to Dulles International Airport, killing all 92 people aboard. The crash investigation required extensive coordination with Mount Weather's security apparatus and drew media attention to the facility's existence that its operators had spent 20 years avoiding. Even after the crash, the government's disclosures about Mount Weather were minimal. The facility was acknowledged to exist. What it contained was not discussed. What has been reported across decades of investigative coverage is a facility designed not just as a physical bunker, but as a complete shadow government infrastructure, with its own police force, fire department, and the capacity to maintain classified records. Senior congressional leaders were reportedly evacuated to Mount Weather in the immediate hours after the September 11, 2001 attacks, confirming that it remains operationally active as a continuity of government site more than 60 years after its construction. The facility sits behind razor wire and armed guards behind a perimeter that communicates, with minimum ambiguity, that curiosity about what is inside it is not encouraged. The continuity of government concept that Mount Weather represents has roots in the Eisenhower administration's response to the nuclear threat, and the facility's design reflects the assumptions of that era, that a nuclear war would be survivable for a functioning government if that government had adequate warning and a prepared location. Whether those assumptions remain valid in the current strategic environment is a debate that defense planners continue to have in spaces that are themselves not publicly accessible. What is clear is that Mount Weather has been maintained, upgraded, and expanded through every subsequent administration, regardless of party, which suggests that the US government's commitment to having a backup version of itself has not diminished. The 1974 TWA crash, beyond drawing attention to the facility, produced a legal and logistical complication. The crash site overlapped with Mount Weather's security perimeter, and the investigation required federal authorities to manage access to a crash scene that happened to be located on one of the most classified pieces of real estate in the country. Families of victims, journalists, and investigators all encountered security restrictions that had nothing to do with the crash itself and everything to do with what the mountain contained. The facility's existence had to be partially acknowledged during the NTSB investigation, simply to explain why normal crash site procedures could not be followed. The congressional and media attention generated by the 1974 crash produced a round of investigative reporting that remains among the most detailed public accounts of what Mount Weather contained. Richard Pollock, reporting for the Progressive magazine in 1976, published a description of the facility that the government attempted to suppress, arguing that the information was classified. The Progressive successfully challenged that suppression. The picture that emerged from Pollock's reporting and subsequent accounts described a facility not merely as a bunker, but as a functioning alternative government, with authority structures, pre-positioned officials, and the operational capacity to continue governing in circumstances where the visible government had ceased to exist. That is a meaningful distinction. A bunker protects people. Mount Weather was designed to protect the continuity of power itself. Number 4. Camp Peary, The Farm, Williamsburg, Virginia. Camp Peary is a 9,000-acre U.S. government facility near Williamsburg, Virginia, administered officially by the Department of Defense as an armed forces experimental training activity. That designation is one of the more transparent euphemisms in the federal government's inventory, in that everyone with any familiarity with American intelligence operations knows that Camp Peary is the CIA's primary training facility for clandestine service officers, universally known as the Farm. The CIA has never officially acknowledged Camp Peary's identity as its training base, which is a position that requires increasingly energetic commitment to maintain, given that the facility has been publicly identified as such in congressional testimony, numerous books by former CIA officers, and decades of journalism. The government's approach has been to neither confirm nor deny, which is a posture that works less well when the thing you are neither confirming nor denying is that well documented. What happens at Camp Peary, based on the accumulated public record from those who trained there and have subsequently written about it, is the foundational curriculum of a CIA clandestine officer: surveillance and counter-surveillance, asset recruitment, codes and communication security, defensive driving, paramilitary skills, resistance to interrogation. The tradecraft that distinguishes a professional intelligence officer from a competent amateur is taught here over a training pipeline that historically runs several months. The facility's location near Williamsburg, surrounded by ordinary Virginia woods and accessible roads that have no visible indication of what they border, is its own form of concealment. Former CIA Director Robert Gates, in his memoir From the Shadows, published in 1996, described his own time at Camp Peary without naming it directly, referring instead to the Farm in the way that virtually every account by former CIA personnel does. The facility appears on no official public map as a CIA installation. Its perimeter signs identify it as a Department of Defense training area. The people who train there are, by the nature of their subsequent work, not in the business of discussing where their skills came from. Camp Peary operates in a space between official denial and unavoidable public knowledge that the U.S. intelligence community has inhabited comfortably for 70 years. The Farm has appeared in fiction almost as often as it has appeared in journalism, which has the effect of making it feel simultaneously more and less real, depending on the consumer's media diet. The novel and film The Recruit, released in 2003, depicted a heavily dramatized version of CIA basic training that drew on published accounts of Camp Peary while naturally compressing and fictionalizing the experience for narrative purposes. Former CIA officer Ishmael Jones, writing under a pseudonym, described the Farm's training environment in his 2008 memoir in terms that were considerably less cinematic, emphasizing bureaucratic procedure and the specific anxieties of learning skills whose actual application would involve real consequences for real people. What the public record on Camp Peary does not include, and what remains genuinely unknown, is the current scope of its training programs. The intelligence community's operational requirements have changed significantly since the Cold War era that produced the Farm's original curriculum. Counterterrorism, cyber operations, drone warfare coordination, and the requirements of contemporary covert action have all evolved in ways that a training facility would need to track. Whether Camp Peary has evolved in parallel is not something anyone at the facility is discussing. The woods around Williamsburg keep their own counsel. Number 3, the Greenbrier Bunker, White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. The Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, is one of the oldest and most prestigious resort hotels in the United States, a National Historic Landmark that has hosted U.S. presidents since James Monroe. It is the kind of place where rooms cost more per night than most Americans spend on rent. It is also, or was, until 1992, the location of a completely secret congressional bunker designed to house all 535 members of Congress in the event of nuclear war. The bunker, codenamed Project Greek Island, was built between 1958 and 1962 beneath a new wing of the hotel called the West Virginia Wing. The construction was accomplished while the resort remained fully operational, with workers telling guests and staff that the extensive excavation underway was for a new exhibition hall. That exhibition hall, called the exhibit hall, was real and functional above ground. Below it, accessible through disguised entrances, was a 112,000 square foot underground facility containing dormitories for 1,100 people, a separate chamber for the House and a separate chamber for the Senate, a decontamination center, a medical clinic, a cafeteria, a television and radio broadcast studio for post-attack communications, and enough diesel fuel and water to sustain operations independently for 60 days. The facility was maintained continuously from its completion in 1962 until 1992, when it was decommissioned following a Washington Post article by journalist Ted Gupp that revealed its existence. The government had managed to keep the bunker secret for 30 years, while maintaining it with a permanent staff embedded at the resort under the cover identity of a communications company called Forsyth Associates. Those staff members were Viasat employees managing the facility's telecommunications systems, who were known to resort staff as the people who lived on the property and maintained the television systems, and whose actual function was never openly discussed. When Gupp published his article in May 1992, the government decommissioned the facility almost immediately on the grounds that its secrecy, the entire premise of its usefulness, had been permanently compromised. The Greenbrier now offers guided tours of the bunker, the dormitories, the congressional chambers, the broadcast studio, and the decontamination showers are all accessible to paying visitors. The whole thing is presented with considerable equanimity, which is either reassuring or slightly surreal, depending on how you feel about the Cold War's proximity to the present day. The story of how the bunker's cover held for 30 years is, in its own way, as interesting as the bunker itself. The Forsyth Associates employees who maintained the facility were known to resort staff and longtime guests as the television people, the quiet professionals who kept the communication systems running and who lived in a dedicated building on the property. They were part of the resort's social environment for decades without any of the surrounding resort operation knowing what they were actually there to do. The secrecy held not through aggressive enforcement, but through the mundane reality that a small group of professionals doing unremarkable-looking maintenance work in a large resort does not attract sustained curiosity from people who are there to play golf and attend conferences. Ted Gupp, the Washington Post journalist who broke the story in May 1992, described in subsequent interviews the specific difficulty of confirming what he had found before publication. The facility's existence was provable through a combination of construction records, interviews with people in the surrounding community, and documentation of Forsyth Associates' unusual staffing arrangements. What he could not get the government to do, before or after publication, was confirm anything about the facility's purpose. The confirmation came implicitly, through the speed with which the government decommissioned the bunker the moment the article ran. If the Post had been wrong about what was underneath the Greenbrier, the government would presumably have said so. It did not. It shut the bunker down instead. The bunker's physical design is a study in Cold War planning assumptions. It was built to house Congress, but not the general public, which tells you something about the priorities of continuity of government planning in the 1950s. The decontamination chambers at the entrance were designed to process incoming legislators who had been exposed to radioactive fallout, a process that presumably did not include extended reflection on what their constituents were experiencing at the surface. The television broadcast studio was equipped to allow surviving government officials to address whatever remained of the American population through whatever remained of the broadcast infrastructure. These were the serious, bureaucratic preparations of a government that had looked squarely at the possibility of nuclear war and responded by building a bunker under a luxury hotel. There is something both impressive and quietly horrifying about the thoroughness of it, which is probably why the tours sell well. Number 2, NSA Utah Data Center, Bluffdale, Utah. The Utah Data Center in Bluffdale, Utah, is the largest data storage facility operated by the National Security Agency, and by the time it became publicly known in 2013, its construction was already complete and its operations had already begun. The facility occupies roughly 1 million square feet of technical space spread across a 240-acre campus, uses approximately 65 megawatts of power, and was built at a reported cost of approximately $1.5 billion. What it stores is data, an almost incomprehensible volume of data, collected through the NSA's surveillance programs. The facility became publicly known in large part through reporting by journalist James Bamford, who described it in a 2012 Wired magazine article before it had opened, drawing on sources within the intelligence community. The following year, documents provided to journalists by NSA contractor Edward Snowden confirmed the facility's existence and provided context for its purpose. The NSA's response to inquiries about the facility has been consistent. It acknowledged the facility's physical existence while declining to discuss its operations, capacity, or the nature of the data it holds. Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, stated in 2012 that Americans would be stunned if they knew the extent of the surveillance programs whose data was being processed through facilities like Bluffdale. That statement was made before the Snowden disclosures of 2013 made the outlines of those programs substantially more public. Whether the public was in fact stunned by what came out, or whether the scale of government data collection had become so normalized in the post-September 11th security landscape that it registered more as confirmation than revelation, is a question that different observers answered differently. The facility in Bluffdale continues to operate. It does not give tours. The technical specifications of the Utah data center, where known, are worth considering as a measure of the scale of modern surveillance infrastructure. The facility's cooling systems alone consume enormous quantities of water from the local water district, a consumption level that attracted attention from Utah officials and journalists trying to understand what the site required and why. The power demand of approximately 65 megawatts is sufficient to supply a small city. The storage capacity, based on estimates from computer scientists and cryptographers who have reviewed what is publicly known about the facility's design, is measured in the range that would allow the long-term storage of a substantial fraction of all internet communications traffic. The Snowden disclosures of 2013 confirmed that the NSA was operating programs, PRISM and Upstream among them, that collected internet communications data on a scale that the Utah data center's infrastructure was designed to accommodate. The legal framework for those programs, rooted in Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and Executive Order 12,333, remains in effect in modified form. The debate about what the government should be permitted to collect and store about its own citizens is ongoing in congressional committees and federal courts. The Utah Data Center sits in the middle of that debate as the physical infrastructure that makes the question real rather than hypothetical. It is a very large building in a suburb of Salt Lake City, surrounded by fencing, staffed by NSA personnel, and full of servers that hold something. The exact nature of what they hold is the question that the government has consistently declined to answer with specificity. Number 1, Area 51, Groom Lake, Nevada. Area 51 is the most famous secret in America, which is itself a paradox worth sitting with for a moment. It is a facility so classified that the CIA did not officially acknowledge its existence until June 2013, and that acknowledgement came not through a press conference or voluntary disclosure, but through a Freedom of Information Act request that George Washington University's National Security Archive had been pursuing since 2005. The declassified history released that day was a CIA account of the U-2 spy plane program, and it was the first official government document to name Area 51, place it on a map, and confirm that the United States had been testing secret aircraft there since 1955. The facility sits at Groom Lake, a dry salt flat in the Nevada desert about 83 miles northwest of Las Vegas, within the 368,000-acre Nevada Test and Training Range. The CIA acquired the site in April 1955 for Project Aquatone. the development of the Lockheed U-2 strategic reconnaissance aircraft. Lockheed's chief aircraft designer Kelly Johnson described the moment his team first saw the site from the air. "We flew over it, and within 30 seconds, you knew that was the place. It was right by a dry lake. Man alive, we looked at that lake, and we all looked at each other." It was another Edwards. The U-2 was followed by the A-12 Oxcart, a Mach 3 reconnaissance aircraft, and subsequently by the F-117A stealth fighter and the B-2 stealth bomber, among other programs that remain partially or entirely classified. The UFO sightings that gave the base its cultural identity were, according to the CIA's own declassified account, largely the result of U-2 test flights at altitudes that no one in 1955 believed aircraft could reach. Commercial pilots and military observers saw silver objects at 60,000 feet catching sunlight in ways that were genuinely unexplained to anyone who did not know a Lockheed spy plane was up there. The CIA acknowledged this in its 1992 internal history, the same document that was released in 2013, and noted that its response to UFO reports generated by U-2 flights was to allow the Air Force to issue weather-related explanations rather than reveal the aircraft's existence. Area 51's restricted airspace, the warning signs at the perimeter informing visitors that deadly force is authorized, and the motion sensors and patrols across the surrounding desert are the current physical reality of the facility's security. The signs mean what they say. In 2019, a Facebook event titled "Storm Area 51, They Can't Stop All of Us" attracted over 2 million declared participants, of whom approximately 150 actually showed up at the gate. The Air Force had positioned additional personnel and made clear in advance that trespassing would be treated as trespassing on a military installation, which under federal law carries a sentence of up to 6 months in prison. The 150 who appeared took photographs of the gate and went home. The facility continues to test aircraft and weapons systems whose nature, 5 decades into the public mythology around the base, remains substantially unknown. The CIA's declassified history covers 1954 to 1974. Everything after 1974 at Groom Lake is still classified. That is 50-plus years of operations that the public record does not reach. The workers at Area 51 present their own chapter in this story. In the 1990s, former workers filed federal lawsuits alleging they had been exposed to hazardous waste at the Groom Lake facility. The cases, brought against the Air Force and the Environmental Protection Agency, claimed violations of federal environmental law related to the handling and disposal of toxic materials on the site. The government's response was to invoke the military and state secrets privilege, supported by classified declarations, to block the disclosure of any environmental data from Area 51. In other words, the government told federal courts that the base was too classified to comply with environmental law. The courts accepted that argument. The workers lost their cases. Several of them died of illnesses they attributed to chemical exposure at the facility. Their families received no acknowledgement, no disclosure, and no compensation that the government was ever required to publicly account for. T.D. Barnes, a CIA contractor who worked at Area 51 beginning in 1968 as a radar expert, spoke in later years about the unofficial names used for the facility by those who worked there: Dreamland, Home Base, Watertown Strip, the latter because Alan Dulles, the CIA director at the time of the U-2 program, came from Watertown, New York. Barnes described an environment of absolute compartmentalization in which workers on different programs at the same facility had no knowledge of what the others were doing. That structure, multiple layers of secrecy within a single classified location, is what has allowed Area 51 to absorb 60 years of outside scrutiny without the full picture emerging. The base was, and almost certainly remains, not one secret, but many, stacked on top of each other in the Nevada desert. If this one had you looking over your shoulder, hit that like button and subscribe. America has more of these than anyone in an official position is going to confirm.